Let's do it.
Cool. And also just to clarify one more time for those of you who for the first time at this workshop is run by Levagon Tokyo, and I'm super happy to welcome Ben from Auth0, who is going to be today's speaker and who's going to talk how to build your React app and a lot of other cool perks that comes with this. And without you, since it's a very intensive workshop, very intensive one, yeah, Ben told me that it's usually for 3 hours, right? But today we're going to squeeze it in 1 hour, 30 minutes. So yes. Without you giving a microphone to Ben, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Sasha. And yes, it is going to be a bit of a compressed timeline. I will try and take my time as much as possible, but I also want to respect all of your time in not going over the 1.5 hours. So what I have here, I'm hoping you can all see my shared screen. What I have here is basically my Git pod.
Not yet.
Not yet?
Can't see your share screen, yeah.
Ah, that's interesting because share must have stopped for some reason. There you go. Let's share this one. How does that look?
Yep, works well.
I love virtual presentations. If it's not the microphone that's not working, it's the shared screen. And I don't think any virtual presentation is quite right if you don't have to ask whether you can see my screen. So anyway, you should, if you've completed the first few steps, you should probably see this at the moment. I'm just going to bring over the GitHub repository that you all have access to, the pre-workshop step. So hopefully at this point, most of you will probably have a GitHub account already. If you don't have an Auth0 account, it's pretty quick to set one of those up, and Stripe as well. Netlify, I don't actually know whether you need to sign up for Netlify. I've tried this without logging in to Netlify in the command line. We're going to be using their command line tools, and it's worked. But it's nice to have a Netlify account anyway, so that at the end of the project, you can do a production publish and share your success with your friends, perhaps. So hopefully you've all got these accounts already anyway. The only other thing you then need to do is you can just go directly off the repository that I've got here, but I would encourage you to fork it so that you can push back any changes that you make. I'm not going to accept any pull requests to mine. If you try and commit to it, you don't have permission to. So fork it, and then you can save your changes into your own GitHub repository. So once you've done that, all you need to do is grab this URL here, copy that, and then at the front of the github.com here, paste that in. Nope, that's the wrong way around. I'm already getting my own talk wrong. Here we go. Let's undo that. This here is the your clone. So what you want to do is copy this bit here and paste that before your GitHub URL. And Gitpod, if you haven't used it before, it's basically a cloud-hosted virtual machine that's got VS Code built in, and it means that you don't need to worry about your local development environment setup. You can just work in a browser, and everything's going to work without there being any conflicts with other development tools you might have installed, which if you've ever done a workshop where you've got to run it on your own machine can sometimes be a bit of a hassle. So hopefully this works a lot better for everybody here. So just grab that gitpod.io/hash, paste it in front of your github.com URL, and that should take you to a page that looks a little bit like this. So hopefully you're all at that point. I will be keeping an eye on the chat. If you've got any questions at any point, please just stick them in the chat, and I will address those that I can within the time that we have. If not, then I can always chat with you afterwards, and of course there'll be the video as well. All right, so switching back here, let's go into step 2. This is the start of the actual workshop. So step 0 and 1, just getting everything prepped. We're now at the start of the workshop. I've already run these two, so go ahead and do these yourselves if you're following along today. There's a useful little copy button on the right here. So we're going to create a new React app, and then we're going to go into that directory and start Netlify dev instead of npm dev. And I'll mention why that is in a second. And you'll see over here that I've already done that. I've got my web store. You'll see also there's steps 2 through 9. This is more useful in one of the longer workshops. If you get to one of the steps and you feel like where you're at the moment, you're not able to complete the current step, you can jump onto the next step, and this code here is almost complete and working, but there are still some things you need to do, so we won't be relying on these today. Hopefully we'll all make it through to the end with the standard web store React app that we've just created. So I ran create React app into the web store, and if we look in here, we can see the standard, if you're familiar with React already, the standard basic React app files in here. One thing we'll need to be careful of as we're creating files today for this app is that we treat the web store here as the root. We don't want to be creating, for example, a source directory in the root of the repository, because the source directory exists already in this case, but the source directory exists in the web store. So just bear in mind that when we're creating files, it needs to be inside this web store directory. And then, yes, just change into that web store directory itself, which I will do now. And then we'll run Netlify Start. So the reason, if I can spell Netlify Start, the reason we're using Netlify instead of npm is that Netlify command line tools allows you to run the APIs. Start is not, it's not Start, it's dev. The Netlify tools allow you to run Lambda functions in your development environment. So when you push into production, Netlify allows anything in the functions directory, I think it's called. We'll come to that in a second. I've been using Vercel a lot recently as well, and I think they use API as their directory. But anything in the functions directory will become a cloud function or a Lambda function. Now, obviously, if you're running npm dev, you're just running Node and React locally, and that doesn't work. So Netlify dev gives us access to those cloud functions in our development environment, which is a very powerful mechanism. I love the Netlify tools for that. All right, so we've got that running. You should now be able to load up your local environment, and you'll see here, I'm not sure how easy it is to make this out, and I can't make it larger because it's an image, but basically your Gitpod URL, if you prefix it with 8888, that'll start running whatever is running on port 8888, which is this one here. So what will have happened, there would have been a little box over here that allows you to load it in a new tab. So I'm just going to stop this and start it again. Sometimes it doesn't pop up. There are a couple of little issues that I'm talking to Gitpod about in terms of this, but it should load up a little, should load up your application in the tab here, which it's not doing. Why is that not working? It's always good when your demo doesn't work to start with. Localhost port 8888 is obviously not going to work because we're not running it on localhost. But interesting. Okay, it looks like something's changed since the last time I gave this workshop. Usually here it'll give you a fuller URL, but when you click on this link, it'll actually open in a new tab. If you allow that, you'll notice here it's actually loaded my Gitpod URL with the 8888 in front of it. So hopefully you're now at the point where you've gotten React installed, you've run Netlify dev. If you then click on this link here in a new tab, it'll open and you can see this running. If you're not at this point, shout out. And to be honest, I'm not sure what we can do about it at this stage, but hopefully you're at this point and we'll continue. If you aren't at this point and aren't able to get it fixed during the session, then if we have time at the end, I'm happy to go through and pick up any issues that you're all having along the way. All right, so that's the basic setup. We've got React, and the goal of the workshop today is to use Stripe in order to be the database, essentially, of all the products that we're going to sell in our web shop. And we're going to use Auth0 as the authentication mechanism, so we know who's logged in and who's buying it. And normally when you're writing an application like this, you would need another database somewhere that links your products to your users and the payments and all of those kind of things. Payments can actually get stored completely in Stripe. Users are all in Auth0. Auth0 also has a feature or a mechanism called actions, which we will be playing with today, which allows you to extend Auth0 to run your own arbitrary code. So rather than creating a whole new database just to store a link between users and Stripe customers, which is essentially the only link we really need, if we know who's logged in, we can connect to the Stripe customer and find out what they've ordered or create a new order for them. We're going to store that information in that link between the two users in both Auth0 and Stripe. And then we're going to use Auth0 actions in order for the React application to have all the information it needs to be able to create an order for a user when they're logged in. This is all very vague, top-level overview. We'll get there as we go through the process. So the first thing we want to do is install a React DOM router. So if you copy this and paste that in down at the bottom, you'll need to stop the application again. And we'll be stopping and starting it throughout the workshop. And we'll get this running. And essentially what this is going to allow us to do is to have different routes or different paths, web page URLs, to have different views and business logic that we're going to run. So we've installed that. And now we want to start creating some of our files. So rather than just having one page for the home page and one page for the logged in page, we're going to do it a bit more sensibly. We're actually going to create structured views within React. So I want you to copy this part here, just the file name. Just a recommendation that you don't copy the first slash. That's just because of the fact that we're already in the web store directory here. So if you copied that and then you go to new file and paste that in, One of the things I like about VS Code is you can actually paste in a whole path and it'll create this directory structure for you. And you'll see now that we have source, and in a second it'll create components layout.js. So we've got our new file here. Let's just close that off. So into our new layout, we're going to paste this code here. And I'm going to be doing a lot of copy and pasting, but I'm also going to talk through at an overview level of what's going on here. So I'm not going to explain how React works. If you haven't developed a React app before, hopefully you're familiar with C-style languages at the very least, and you've done some JavaScript, so most of this will be somewhat familiar to you. But essentially what we're doing here is we're creating a component called layout that we can then use from any of our pages to give a consistent look and feel to the application. And when this component is used, anything inside that component in the other page, and we'll see an example of that in a second, will be rendered through this children. But it means that we can have a consistent header and navigation on all of our web pages. And in our navigation at the moment, we're just going to have a link to our homepage. So I'm going to save that. The next file we want to create is one of the pages. So let's create pages home. This is obviously going to be our homepage. So going back into Web Store, new file, paste that in. And then we'll copy this. So essentially what we're doing here is creating another component. This is our homepage component. And in here, we're basically saying, welcome to my web store. That's all we have in here at the moment. So we need a way to wrap the layout around this, and we'll come to that in a second. The other page that I want to create is the success page. So once somebody's ordered something from us, we want to show them a page that says, thank you for your order. So we'll come back in here, web store, new file, and we're going to create source pages success. And I'll copy and paste this in. Very similarly, we've got a component called success, and it says, thank you for your order. All very simple so far, I hope. The next thing we want to do is edit this file here. So source app.js already exists, and this is basically the entry point for the system. I've just been given a call out to check to see how people are doing. I can stop at this point and see how people are doing. The crux of this all gets tied in this page, and we should be able to see some output soon. But if there are any people who are having issues with where we're up to, hopefully we've got our components directory and our pages directory with the layout and the home and the success in there. And if you are not at this point already, just give me a hands up or a thumbs down or something in the comments. If you're good to continue, give me a +1 or a thumbs up, and just to get a sense of where we're all at the moment. So we're having an issue with somebody, the Git pod is not loading. So if you also having the same issue. So I'd be interested to know what you can see. So if I open up a new hidden window, Git pod. So what you should see is something that looks a little bit like this to start with. And then you would continue with your GitHub account, which I'm not logged into because it's a private window. And then it'll start. Let me see if I can do this in. Where did it all go? So I want this one here. gitpod.io/hash. So this is where you want to be going to. gitpod.io/hash, then GitHub all the way to the end. That'll be your username there, followed by write your own web store in hours. And then once you're logged into Gitpod, I'm getting this because I've already got another one running. So you then get this part next. And basically this is now booting your virtual machine. So the next screen is showing preparing, but only 1 bar out of 3. Okay, it might just be a timing thing. So Gitpod does take a while to boot up, which is, so this is a screen that you're getting. Yeah, so it should take, it usually only takes about 2 or 3 minutes. So I was hoping with the rambling that I had at the beginning that that I would have talked through that point, but you should get to this fairly quickly. Okay, you're in. Is anybody else having problems with Gitpod? I can pause a little longer while you all catch up still, and then I'll just go over what we've done already so that you can catch up with that. So just to review where we got up to in here, in this first step. So now that you've all got a Git pod running, you need to run npx create React app web store or Netlify dev. Show you what you should be able to see, and hopefully we'll be able to get all up to this point. Go back into my code here under web store app.js. Sorry, web store source app.js. This is the main app. It's not necessarily the entry point as such, but it's the top level application where most of the React stuff kind of comes together. And you can see in here that this is the main page that we can see here. We've got the spinning logo, edit this file, and a link to Learn to React. So we've got the spinning logo, edit this file, and a link to Learn to React. So what I want to do with this is just completely replace it. And I'm going to copy this and paste over that completely. So I'll talk through and give you some time to catch up to this point, hopefully. I'll talk through where we're at the moment in terms of the code. We'll save it and we'll see what's happening. So this is the entry point. We're basically creating a React app. We've imported React DOM router earlier on in this step. And from that, we want a couple of components out of that we're going to use. So we need to wrap the whole thing in a browser router. And this basically allows our browser to communicate with React and pass the URLs through. Because there's a single page app, when you go to a different URL, you're not actually reloading the page. You're just creating an event in JavaScript, essentially. So if the URL ends in success or is equal to /success, we want to pull in the success element. And this success element is the page success that we created earlier. So if you go to /success, you should get this content. Going back to app.js, if you just go to the root page, you should get the home content. And then remember also we created the components layout. That's this part here. So essentially this app is saying we're going to have some kind of routing mechanism. Every page that we render is going to have the layout. And then layout itself has this children. The children are passed in through the call to the, or through the, it's basically the contents of the layout object or the layout component. So everything inside here is essentially the children. And this here is either going to be success or home, depending on which page you go to. So you can see it's fairly nested, but it means that you can wrap a lot of things up and reuse a lot of the components in this way. So I've just hit save. If I come over here and hit refresh, then that's not working because you need to restart Netlify dev. So make sure that's running. You'll find that I forget this fairly often as we go through this process. And if we come over here and refresh, still loading. It says it's ready. There we go. One last time. So now we've got my web store, we've got the home link, and we've got home, welcome to my web store. So this part here was in our home component, and this part here was in our layout. And if you just manually add success to the end, you should see the thank you for your order. But we're not going to create a link to that because we don't want to link people to a success page. The success page is where we send people once they've managed to make an order. So I'll just go back to the home page. Now, one thing you can do to make this a lot prettier is there is a file down here under workshop assets. And if you're looking at the documentation, I mentioned that down here. So under workshop assets, app.css. So if you come into workshop assets, app.css, I'm just going to copy the entire contents of this workshop assets app.css file. Then I'm going to come up here into our web store source app.css. So this is the actual CSS file for our web app. I'm going to replace all of this with what I just copied from this page down here. And now our page is a lot prettier. Pretty is important. You can tell I'm a software engineer because it's not that pretty, but it's prettier. All right, that takes us to the end of step 2. Hopefully everybody's at that point. Give me a thumbs down if you need me to pause, otherwise I shall continue. The next thing we want to do is define our product catalog. And for this, we're not going to do any coding whatsoever. I want you to go into the Stripe account that you've created and come over to the product section. And once you're in this page here, I want you to come in and add some products. Now, the only thing that I need you to add is a name, a description, an image. I say the only thing, we pretty much need to fill all of these out. If you have cloned the repository to your hard drive, then you will also have access to, under Workshop Assets, Stripe product images, some sample images that I've added in here. Unfortunately, there's no real easy way to get them out of Gitpod. I don't think you can do a right-click save. Not really. Unfortunately, being VS Code, it's kind of a bit too integrated and doesn't allow you to. Can I download? Download. Oh, there you go. There's an option for you. So you can come to Workshop Assets, Stripe Products, and you can select some of these images if you want them. They're all 400 by 400 pixels already. And you can come to Download, and then you can use those if you want, or you can use any image that you want really here. So I've already created some. While you're creating yours, I'll just show you what I have. So we basically got a pair of headphones. I've charged $149 for them. So when you're creating the pricing, make sure that you select one-time price, not a recurring price, and give it some kind of value here. The actual value here doesn't really matter, the currency. It's up to you which one of those you choose. But yeah, use a one-time. You can put a recurring one in as well. Your project will still work. It's just going to have a slightly different interface when you get into the payment part of it. So I've got my two products here. Hopefully you've got at least one product. Two products is will allow you to test two different products and make sure the integration into Stripe is working. When you click on one, you're buying that one. When you click on the other one, you're buying the other one. If you just have one, obviously you can't test to make sure that that's all aligning properly. But for the general purposes of this workshop, just one will do. So we've created those, and that's the entirety of step 3. That was nice and easy. How are you all going? Do we all have a couple of products in there? Are you ready to write some Lambda functions? I'll take that as a resounding yes. All good. Shout out if you need any more help. All right, so the next step is, Sasha's getting there. I'll give us a couple of extra minutes. So yeah, when you're adding a product, just make sure you're doing a one-time, put in any kind of price that you want. The description is what we're going to be using as the actual description in our web page, and the name. So you can see that we're using this essentially as a database. If I was to create an application like this and use Stripe for selling stuff, but then also have MongoDB, for example, for an actual resource of content, we would have to store a name and a description and a price and stuff anyway. So we're essentially able to store everything that we need. Maybe it wouldn't scale perfectly. Maybe in the future you'll want to add extra information around these products. But for a general web store, there's plenty of information in here. All right, I shall carry on. So the next part is to write a Lambda function. So for this, we're going to need to install some more modules. So just copy this part here, and I'll talk through what we're actually doing. Let's close some of these back to the app we were running. So I'm going to stop the Netlify server. I'm going to paste this part in. So we're installing, let's hit enter so we can actually start it while I'm talking. We're installing the Stripe module, which is what's going to allow our backend service, our Lambda functions, to communicate with the Stripe API. So that's server-to-server component. There's a secret key involved, and the use of that module is specifically for server-to-server. I'm also installing, because we'll need it at some point in the future within this this workshop, the Stripe.js module. And this is what we're going to use from the front end, from the React app. So this is about the browser talking to Stripe in order to set up things like buying a product or starting a checkout process or those kind of things. Then finally, I'm installing .env, which if you're not familiar with it, is basically a way for us to inject environment variables into a development environment, particularly, that will then pull those variables out of a .env file, rather than having to put them into actual environment variables within the system. And when you go into production, you would set up environment variables through Netlify's environment variable management tool through the dashboard or through their command line CLI. But for development, .env files are a very neat way to go. They allow you to separate this information out and not put them into your GitHub repository as well. So with those in, let's have a look at the next step. So we're going to create, it is the Netlify directory. So anything inside the Netlify functions directory becomes a Netlify function. So I'm going to copy this here and then back at web store. So remember to right click on web store, new file, and we're going to create Netlify functions products.js. And this is going to create an endpoint for us called products that will return, ideally, some products from Stripe. So the things we need to do, I'm just going to copy this, paste it, and then we'll talk through it because it's easier to look through it in the editor here than it is in the GitHub README file. So the Stripe module that we just installed, we're going to pull that into a local variable called Stripe. And we're going to pass into that the secret key. So we're going to need to define that in a second. And then once this is available to us, we can then return a handler. So exports.handler means that the result of this code running will export a function that gets executed when the API call to the product endpoint is created. And when you make an API call to a Netlify function, it receives two parameters, at least two parameters. The event, what's actually triggered it, information about the request, and then context, which allows you to do to get more information about the way things were called. And yeah, we'll mostly be looking at the event for this one. So I've put in documentation here as well that we can mostly skip over, but there are links into the actual API documentation if you want to learn more about these particular ones. But essentially what we're going to be doing, and remember, we've passed in the Stripe secret key already. So this object here is fully aware of how to talk to our particular instance of Stripe. And what we're doing is basically calling Stripe and saying, give me a list of all the prices. Now, interestingly, the way that Stripe works is rather than getting a list of products and getting all of their prices, you actually get a list of prices and then get all of the products within the price. Now, a price will only actually have one product, but a product can have multiple prices. So it's an interesting way of flipping it around. But because that's the way that Stripe gives it to us, we need to read it in that format. So getting a list of all the prices and then getting the product for that price. But we're going to switch the array around because we actually want to give back to our application a list of products which have prices, if that makes sense. So we're taking a nested object and we're going to flip it around. How do we do that? So we call Stripe prices list. And one of the things you can pass into quite a lot of the Stripe functions is this expand attribute. And what we're saying here is when you get the price, I want you to expand and inside of that price also get out the product. So we're now going to get the product as part of the response to this prices.list. So we don't need to make a separate call to Stripe. And then what we're going to do is start with an empty array of products because we don't have them defined yet. And we're going to use the map function to iterate through all of the prices that we've just received from Stripe. So for each of the prices that we've just received, we're going to pull the product out as a separate variable, and then we're going to delete it out of the price object. So now we've got two standalone objects. We've got the product and the price. Neither of them refer to each other anymore. And we can work from here. First thing we want to do is check to see if the product's active. We want to ignore inactive product. So if the product is active, then we're going to call this, and this is a little convoluted, but essentially what this is doing is saying, find all of the products in the existing array of products, which currently is empty, because this is the first time we're running it. But the next time it'll be the first product we found. Go through a list of all the products. And if the product we're looking at in this iteration of the loop, if the ID of that matches any of the products that we've already seen, then the product exists. The product exists in our array already, in our products array up here. So if it exists, then we're basically going to push the price that we've got now on top. So and this isn't going to affect us, but in the scenario where you have one product with two prices, we would have actually received from Stripe two prices with the same product inside. So the first time we did it, we created a new product and added the price. Second time, because the product exists already, this price that we've got gets added in on top. If we haven't seen this product already, then we're going to push the whole product along with the price into the products array. If you're not familiar with this level of this type of JavaScript, don't worry too much about it. But essentially, the documentation, the comments give it away to you. Do we have a product already? If yes, add this price into the existing product that we know about. Otherwise, create a product for us. And then right at the end, we basically return all of the products as a JSON string. So if I save this now, and we make sure that Netlify dev is running again, we should be able to come over to our application here. And, oh no, we do need to do one more thing. We need to put the Stripe secret key in. But just to show you what I was about to do, the APIs get exposed under the .netlify. So it's not, even though the file name is Netlify functions products, the actual URL includes a dot. And this is mostly so that a dot at the beginning of file name usually means it's hidden, so things are less likely to be indexed or displayed accidentally when you're looking at directory listings of web directories, if that makes sense. But before we do that, I did forget that we need to add our environment variable. So in Web Store, we're going to create a new file and we'll call it .env. So that's appeared down here now. And into this environment variable file, we're going to create, I'll just paste this in so we can see it more easily. We're going to create an environment variable called Stripe secret key, which aligns with the code we just wrote, Stripe secret key. So now whenever we see process.env.stripe secret key, it's going to replace that with the value of our actual secret key, which is obviously not full of dots. We need to get the actual version out. So if you jump back into Stripe and go over to developers, you'll see on the right-hand side over here, we've got our publishable key and our secret key. So I'm just going to reveal this. I need to enter my password. Oops, I need to unlock my password manager. Fun times. So this is this password here, please. All right, so here's my secret key. Click to copy. And then come back in over here and paste this in. So I'm quite happy for you to all see this. I don't mind if it's in recording because this is a test key. Obviously, you would not want to commit this .env file into your repository, and you wouldn't want to share the production version of this key anyway. But as we're testing at the moment, I'm not at all worried about the fact that I'm sharing this with you. I'm going to hit save. One thing we do need to do, though, is we need to restart Netlify. Because this is an environment variable, Netlify or Node, because Netlify dev is actually running Node with a whole load of other stuff, Node is going to create, when it first starts up during the bootstrapping process of Node, that's when it'll pull in environment variables. So if you make a change to the .env file, Node is not going to know about that until you restart Node, because it doesn't monitor that file. So that being done now, we should be able to come over here and go to /.functions .netlify functions products. And all things being well, you should see something like this. It's ugly, but it's JSON. And we like JSON when it's ugly. I'm not sure if we do. Let's just, you don't need to do this part. I'm just going to do a JSON decode. Just so we can see what's going on in here. So we've got our two products. And in here, we can see that our first product has a title or a name. Where's it gone? There's the description. Here we go, name. My eyes just aren't working. So we've got the name of the product, we've got our description, and then we've got a set of prices. I only have one price, and the price here is 14,900 cents, or $149. And then we've got our second product, which is the hopping shoe, and the price in here, oops, is $49. So you don't need to break this down. If you can see something that looks like JSON, then it's working. If you're getting an empty array, then there's an issue. If you're getting an error, there's a different kind of issue. But hopefully at this point, you're all getting something out that shows that there's at least one sensible looking JSON-ish product being defined. Let's just close that. All right, we've written our first cloud function. Congratulations. And it's not even in the cloud. It's just running on our own local machines. So we've grabbed the API key and we've restarted Netlify dev. We've gone to this Netlify functions products endpoint, and we're getting some form of JSON out, I hope. Give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down, either way, in the chat, and let me know how you're going. Excellent. I'll take oh, 2 thumbs up. I was going to say I'll take Renato's single thumbs up as a comment on everybody. I'm glad it's going well. This is always good. It's always quite frustrating to do this over this medium because I can't see your faces. It's very hard to judge whether or not you're completely confused, or as in Mylene, I think. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. In your case, you're now just gone into listening mode, but hopefully the video will help you afterwards. But it's always interesting talking to a black box. So I'm glad you're keeping up, and I'm loving the feedback. So thank you for that. All right, let's move on to the next step. Now we've got our products in Stripe. We've got our API that's allowing us to pull them out. Let's display them in our actual React app. So we've already got a home.js. What we want to do now is replace the contents entirely. We could just do mini updates to it, but let's replace the contents entirely and read through what the new version of the home page is now going to show us. So switching back over here, coming down to Web Store, Source, Pages, Home. Let's just select all of that and replace it, and let's see what's going on in here. So we've got a couple of extra things now. We've got use effect and use state. As I said, I'm not going to go into too much technical stuff around React and how it works, but essentially, use state is a way for us to remember information and update that information in a neat way. And use effect is a bit of a misnomer. Basically, what we're doing is the effect that we're looking for is the loading of the component for the first time, and anything in the array here. If the values of that change, then this will get run as well. Again, so what am I saying? This function here, which is an anonymous function, this function here gets executed the first time this page loads, and if anything in this array ever changes. Now this is a setter. The setter never changes. So this is only going to run the first time the component loads. And this is a great way, in this example, for, particularly, we want to make a request to an API to say, hey, give me all the products. We only want to do that the first time the component loads, because then we have the information. We don't need to do it again. But it kind of happens a little bit asynchronously. So all of this gets rendered, but the information in here doesn't actually load until products is available. So the way this part here works is we're basically saying, if products evaluates as true, or if it's truthy, so it doesn't need to be exactly equal to true, it doesn't need to be a Boolean, but we start products out as null, or undefined, rather. So at first, this is going to evaluate as falsy, so this is not going to get rendered. But once we have product information, then we can go through the list of products with our map function, and for each product, we can output this div, which contains the name, the image, the SKU, the description, the price, and a buy now button. And this part here can render while this part here is also running, so we're not slowing down the user interface. And then once the result comes back from our API, those products will get added in automatically. So if I save this, and we come back over to our page here and go back to the home page, oh, it is running. I was just checking that I'd started Netlify. We now have our 2 products coming through, and hopefully you've got something similar. Now, depending on what images you uploaded, this might look a little messier, because I've used 400 by 400 pixel images for everything. If it looks slightly messy, my apologies. My CSS wasn't designed for you. But you're welcome to go and change that afterwards if you like, or upload some 400 by 400 pixel images. But you can see here we've got the name, we've got the description, we've got the price coming out, we've even got the SKU. Not that this is overly important to a user, but it's something we've got, so I wanted to put it in the page. We have these buy now buttons, but they don't do anything yet. So we'll get to that. So I think that's the end of this step. Yeah, hopefully you're at this point. We will have a recording available later, don't worry. Loving the descriptions. Yes, I also always like my... So for those of you who haven't actually looked into the descriptions, I always try to put little Easter eggs, little funny bits in. So this shoe here is only the left shoe. We don't actually sell the right shoe. And it's half price because there's only one. And these headphones here are seen on Twitch streamers. Could we start the render with an empty use state as such? So Renato has just asked whether we could start with this. We could. I don't know what this is actually going to do to us, but what you would probably more accurately want to do is square brackets, because we're mapping, so it's looking for an array. But now we're getting an error with unparsed token on line 45. Yeah, that's because I've got an extra one of those in there. So is that working? So that's compiled. So you could start with that. What that's now going to do, though, is this is going to evaluate as truthy. So it's going to map through an empty array, which means that you're doing something when there's nothing to really do. So I would probably go with something that's going to evaluate as falsy, so that this part here doesn't even get run until you get your first product, if that makes sense. All right, let's move on to authenticating users. This is where we come into the Auth0 stuff. So jump over to your Auth0 application. You should see something that looks a little bit like this after you've created your account. And we will start configuring Auth0 for authentication of users in our single page app. I need to remember to keep to the script so that you can follow along later, because I have a tendency to jump ahead. So making sure that I'm doing things in the right order. First thing we're going to do is create an application. We're going to make sure that it's a single page application. We can actually create multiple different types of application. When I say here we're creating an application, this is defining our application to Auth0. So Auth0 knows how to interact with our React app. And we're going to be doing single page application, which has a different way of completing the authorization flow, because there is no backend server in play like there would be with a PHP or even a Next.js product. So the way that Auth0 or the processes that Auth0 is going to use for authenticating users is going to change depending on whether it's a single page app like React, a regular web application like Python, native like Android, or even a desktop application. And then we also have these machine-to-machine applications where you just have two servers talking to each other. They're very different because it's not about the user anymore. It's more about servers being authenticated to communicate with each other. But that's a discussion for another day. But we want to make sure that we're creating a single page application. So to do that, we'll come over to the Applications tab on the left, to the Applications option under the Applications tab on the left. Yes, it's confusing that they're both called the same thing. No, I don't know why. Will it ever change? Who knows? But for the moment, this is the way it is. So we're going to create a new application definition in here. You'll all have started with this generic default app one. We're going to ignore that one. So come over to create a new application, give this a name like My Web Store. I've done that before, haven't I? And select single page application and hit create. So the first thing you're going to land on is this quick start page. We're going to ignore it, but I'm just going to quickly show you what this allows you to do in case you want to use Auth0 for something else in the future. So if we'd chosen a native application, the options here would have been different. You would have had Swift and Android and that kind of thing. Because we chose single page application, we've got a couple of single page app quick start guides. And if you went into these, you could go through and be taken step by step through the process of configuring Auth0, which modules you need to install, how to code it into your React app. We're going to cover this as part of the workshop already anyway. But this is here and a really easy way to get other technologies working with Auth0 quickly. So that's something you can use if you're ever using it for a different project. What I want you to do though is go over to the settings tab, because that's where we're going to be doing our work today. So from the settings tab, we want to configure 3 different URLs, the callback URL, the logout URL, and the web origin. And you can see here that we've got our gitpod.io domain. So if we jump back over into our actual running application over here, so your home page, I want you to just copy the URL. If you have anything at the end there, make sure it ends in IO. Just copy everything up to the IO point. And we're going to scroll down in our settings page here. And they're conveniently all next to each other, callback, logout, and web origin. So very quickly to describe why we're doing this. When you log into any kind of application using an OpenID connector provider like Auth0, you get redirected to a website that's hosted by Auth0. And that's how we manage to keep things a lot more secure, make sure we're only using HTTP cookies. We've got SSL certificates are all tied up, all of that kind of thing. Make it really hard to do cross-site scripting attacks. So we get a lot of control to keep you safer, but it means that we have to redirect people back to your application. We want to make sure that we're only redirecting people back to where you want them to be redirected to, because we don't want to accidentally have somebody craft some kind of a link that causes your users to log in to your Auth0 tenant and then be redirected somewhere else. The risk of what would happen if that did happen is low, but we just want to stop that happening completely. So that's why we define where the callback URL can be after you click the logout button, where can you be redirected back to. And also, one of the things with single page applications in particular is if you right click open in a new tab or you refresh the application, you lose all the state because everything's in the browser. So rather than storing information about the user's login, like the identity tokens, rather than storing that in a JavaScript cookie or local storage or something like that, what the SDK does that we're going to be using in React is it'll make a request to your Auth0 tenant saying, hey, is this user logged in? Because Auth0 is a front-end, back-end application with a session, it knows. So the web origin basically says which applications, which single-page applications are allowed to make that request to see whether or not the user is logged in. Because again, we don't want to be accidentally giving information about your logged-in users to a different website. So that wasn't so short, but essentially we're putting these in there just to increase the security. And in fact, it's not just to increase it, they're required for the level of security that keeps you safe. Now we do need to come down to the bottom and click Save Changes. There are some areas in Auth0 that you just click and the change is immediate. In this case, because it's configuration, that could potentially, if you had something wrong in here, it could potentially break the application. So we need you to specifically hit the Save button. So that's that part done. The next thing we want to do is install the Auth0 React library. So copy this line here, and we'll come back in here, stop node, and install this. While that's going, let's have a look at some of the code we're going to install. Now, this information is pretty much taken out of the quick start. So if you've used Auth0 before, you probably, with React, you'll be familiar with most of this. We're now going to come into our source index.js. So this is actually the entry point of our application, whereas app.js was more around defining the construction of your web application. Index.js is a lot more, this is the root, essentially. This is where we start the actual rendering of the application. So in here, we want to put the Auth0 provider. And basically what this provider does, provider is a React term. Basically what it does is it provides access to Auth0 based functionality from any point of your application. So we can go into the layout component and don't have to configure Auth0 from scratch there. So this is a good place to put information like this. So we want to import, let's just copy this. We want to import the Auth0 provider from the module that we just installed. And then we want to wrap, let's just copy this. So I've copied that. I'm going to delete the app from here and then paste this in because we've got the app in there again. Just clean this up. So essentially what we've done is we've taken the app that we had before and we've wrapped it in this provider, which means that anything within this application now has an app being, just for completeness, app being this component here that we've defined, the main top level application component. So the app now has access to the Auth0 provider. We just need to paste in our domain, our client ID. So let's jump back over here. If you scroll to the top of this page that we just made changes to, you'll see the domain and the client ID here. A client ID can be public. There's no secret. The secret, obviously, you need to keep secret. We can't paste this into a React application, but the client ID and the domain are fine to be publicly available and readable. So I'm going to copy the domain here and paste that into here. And copy the client ID and paste that into here. Now, it would make a lot more sense at this point to move this into the .env file. But for the purposes of the workshop, because we're a bit constrained on time, I'm not going to do that. But just remember that if you are creating environment variables that React needs to be able to see, then they do need to start with React app and then whatever the name is. That's because we don't want to, this is a Netlify thing, I think. We don't want the Stripe secret key to be passed into React. So the only variables that will get passed to React are ones that start with React app. And feel free to implement these into environment variables as an exercise in your own time if that's something you want to do. But for now, we're just going to hit save on this one and continue, keep the momentum going. So we've done that, and now what we want to do is show a login button if the user is not logged in. So let's jump to the home page, Web Store components, the Web Store pages home. So looking at this section down here now, we want to add a bit of information in. So I'm just going to copy this, paste it in, and then again, we'll talk through what's going on. So copying this top portion here, we're not going to be replacing anything, we're adding things in. So on the second line here, let's paste that in there. Because as well as having this home component, we're going to create a new component called Buy Now button. We're not going to export this. This is only going to be available within this file. But it means that we can reuse this component in our home component. It's a nice way of nesting things. And the way we do that is we copy this second part here. And then if you scroll down to where the buy button is, let's replace this with what I just copied. Neaten that up a bit. So essentially what's happening now is we're calling this buy now button component. That's what we defined up here. And we're passing the product in as an attribute. So now we can consolidate all of the buy now stuff in a separate component without making this a little bit messier. It's nice and neat now. So what does the buy now button actually do though? We're going to call the use Auth0 hook, which is part of the React SDK that we provide. And this hook basically allows us to pull out a number of different components and functions that we want to use within our application. And for logging in, there are three things we want to know. Is the module still loading? Is the user authenticated? And we also want a link to a function called login with redirect. What is loading is doing, remember before I said that when the application is refreshed, for example, or you go to it for the first time that day, it doesn't know whether or not the user is logged in yet. So is loading is basically a Boolean that the Auth0 SDK is going to return to tell you whether or not it's still trying to work out whether or not the user is logged in. As soon as this loading is false, we can trust whether or not the user is logged in based on the is authenticated. So how does that work? We've got this this function here called buy, which we're going to use as a click handler. We'll fill that out a little bit later in the workshop. But to start with, if we're still loading, return an empty component. So what that means is that this down here will just not display anything if we're still loading. And that's only going to be for a short period of time while the application is trying to work out whether or not the user is logged in. As soon as we know that, we can say, okay, well, if they are authenticated, then we're going to return a buy now button. We know who they are. They can add it to the cart. Well, we don't have a cart. They can buy now. Otherwise, so if it's not loading and it's not authenticated, we're going to return a login button. And this button calls login with redirect, which we've gotten from the Auth0 hook up here. So when you click on login to purchase, it calls the login with redirect function that's provided as part of the SDK. So all of the really nasty, junky stuff is stored inside the SDK. You don't need to worry about managing whether or not the user's logged in and where to send them to. That's all taken care of for you. And then the other thing we want to do is provide a logout button. So let's jump into source component layout. I'm just going to make sure I've saved this one. So Web Store source components layout. So we've got a home button here at the moment. We want to add in a logout button. So I'm just going to copy all of this and replace it because there's an extra line at the top and there's some lines in here. And I'll just talk through what's actually changing. So let's replace that. We've pulled in the use Auth0 hook again so that we can use that there. And then we're calling the use Auth0 hook to call again is loading and is authenticated. You'll see this one coming up a lot when you're using Auth0. This time, instead of login with redirect, we want a logout function. And the bit that I've added in down here is basically saying if we're not loading, so if we know the state of the user and we're authenticated, so the only thing to show is the logout button, then in the same format here, link li home, we've got a link button and the text here. The CSS will actually make the button and the link look the same, so that's kind of nice. So we're not loading anymore. We know the state of the user and they are authenticated. We're going to render a button that calls logout on click and says logout. So now, all things being well, let me just double check I haven't skipped anything. Yep, we should be good to go. If you're all up to this point, give me a thumbs up and follow along. Come back to the page over here now, and we hit refresh. We're going to come back over here. I told you I was going to do this all the way through. Let's start Netlify again. It's a good opportunity for me to take a break from speaking, give you a break from having me droning in your ears. Couple of thumbs up, awesome. Renato says, when I added the button, React went blank. I'd be interested to see, Renato, whether if you stop and restart Netlify and then refresh the web page, whether that fixes it. Because it might just be that the moment you pasted it in, the web application refreshed and we maybe hadn't completed all of the changes yet. So give that a go and see if that helps. Ideally, what you'll see now is a login to purchase button instead. So if you click on login to purchase, it should redirect you to a web application that shows the name of your tenant. And that's basically when you created your account, you would have been asked for a tenant name. If you'd gone with the default randomly generated one, it'll look similar to this, dev-something. You can also see what that is up at the top left-hand side of your login area over here. So hopefully that's pointing to the same one. If it isn't, there's something very strange going on because you just managed to guess somebody else's domain and client ID. So if you've done that, congratulations. You've achieved the almost impossible. Now, because if you've created a new Auth0 tenant, and when I say tenant, you can have multiple, this domain here, you can actually have multiple tenants within your login. When you create an Auth0 account for the first time, we create a default tenant for you. And if that's your situation, you have one tenant, you won't have any users in there yet. If you've used Auth0 before and you're reusing one of your tenants, then you might already have users. If that's the case, you can log in as one of those users. But most of us will have created a new Auth0 account for this, which means that we don't actually have any users to log in as yet, so we need to sign up first. You could also continue with Google if you want to do that. I generally like to create accounts specifically for each system that I'm using. So I'm going to come in here. I'm very bad at typing and talking at the same time, and just create a new account. Once you've got those, we'll click continue, and what this is going to do is create an Auth0 user account within your tenant, and then redirect back to the application with information about the user who just logged in. So now we can see the Buy Now button. At the top here, you should be able to see a Logout button. So Renato and Ryota both had the same issue. Is the page come back for you? Has the page come back for you now? Not yet. Interesting. Still blank. Make sure you've saved all the changes, all the pages that you've made changes to as well. And have a look to see if there are any errors coming up in the console log at the bottom here. If that doesn't help you, then for timing purposes, I'll have to continue. And this also switch to listening mode. This also depends a lot on everyone here and Sasha, but I'm happy to stay after I think we have 28 minutes left, so I'm happy to stay after that to help anybody out. If that doesn't impact anybody's time, I want to be respectful of people's times, but I'm happy to stick around if people need help. Otherwise, there'll be the video to go through as well. All right. So we've got that. Next, now we want to do, this is kind of the crux of this all. So we've got our Auth0 user. We now want to create a Stripe user, but we want to create a Stripe user for the Auth0 user, or rather it's called a Stripe customer, and then an Auth0 user. So if you've used Stripe before, you might be familiar with the idea of your application creating a Stripe customer ID as part of the purchasing process. What we're going to do though is we're going to use Auth0 Actions, which is a place where you can write your own custom code inside of Auth0 that allows you to do stuff as part of the authentication process. So we're actually going to create a Stripe customer at the time of the person logging in. And then we're going to link those two together and then make all of that information available to the React application. Let's see how that works. So I want to jump over to the actions library in the left-hand side and create a new action called link user to Stripe. All right, let's do that. So over in our Auth0 dashboard here, we've got actions, and under actions, we've got library. So we'll jump into actions library. And you can see they'll probably be blank, but you'll see installed and custom libraries over here. So you can create your own custom code. We're going to build a custom one, and we're going to call this, what's it, link user to Stripe. It doesn't actually matter what you call this. Descriptive is usually good. As I say, I can't type and text write at the same time. It's going to be a login, post login based on this trigger. So we can run actions at different points of the authentication process. We can do it just after they've logged in. We can do it after they first ever created an account, or just before they're about to create an account. We can run scripts after they change the password. It might make sense. You might think to yourself, why wouldn't I do it after the user is registered? Well, in my case, I've already just created an account. So I want to do it on post login, because for any user that might already be in the database, I want to make sure they've got a Stripe customer ID. So every time somebody logs in, we're going to check to see if they have one. And if they don't, we'll create one for them. So we're going to create, after login, a new action called link user to Stripe. You can choose the runtimes down here as well. We generally have the current and the previous. Try and stick with the current if that's at all possible. So we have yet another editing environment. And in here, we've got, similar to the Netlify one, we've got a method of exporting functions. And in this case, because we're creating a post-login trigger or action, it's called onExecutePostLogin. So this function here will get called when somebody logs in as part of that flow. And I'll show you how we fit that in and how you can have multiples running in different orders if you wanted to. And like most cloud functions, we get two attributes that come in. Event is information about the user that's logging in, about the environment that they're logging in from, about their geo location, that kind of stuff. So anything that we might consume within our function. Then API gives us a whole lot of outcomes or actions that we can take as part of this function as well. We also have a couple of things on the left here. We can install any NPM module, almost any NPM module. If it has static bindings or relies on any C-based libraries, then you can't use them for potentially obvious reasons. But outside of that, almost all NPM modules can be used. We're going to want to use the Stripe one in a second. We can also store secrets in here so that you don't see them in your code. And we have a little testing area so that you could actually modify some sample data that would get passed into this function and see what the output is. We won't play with that one today, but if you're ever using actions, it's a great way of testing stuff before this code goes into production. So let's just jump in here and install the Stripe SDK. So the box on the left-hand side, we're going to add a module, and just type in Stripe, spell it correctly. Leave the version blank for latest, and you can see now that we have the Stripe module available to us within this code. It's kind of cool. And then we're going to want to store our Stripe secret key. So coming over to the keys here, we're going to add a secret. We're going to call it Stripe. I'm going to copy and paste because I often go wrong when I do things that are wrong. Where can I copy and paste it from? Stripe secret key. Because that's the worst kind of bug to debug. And the value, we're going to have to jump back over to our Stripe account over here. So the secret key is still there. I've copied that. Let's paste that in here and click create. So now we've got Stripe's secret key as a secret available to our code. So we've got the secret key available. We've got the Stripe module available to us. The next thing to do is to actually fill in the function. So I'm going to copy this and then we'll talk through what's actually going on here. We're pulling in Stripe, we're passing in the secret key, same as we did for our Netlify function. So we now have this Stripe function or object that we can call. And the first thing we want to do is, and I'll show you what this looks like in the user object in a second, but we can store data in Auth0 against the user. There's the app metadata and the user metadata. And in this particular case, we're going to be using the app metadata. And we're going to check to see whether the user who's trying to log in has some app metadata already called Stripe customer ID. And if they do, we're just going to return out of this function. If they already have one, we don't need to do anything else. If they don't, we continue executing. We're going to use the Stripe function that we've the Stripe module that we've called in over here, and we're going to call customers create. And into that, we're going to pass an object with some extra information. We're going to tell Stripe what the user's email is. We can pull this out of event user email. You don't need a description. I don't think it's a required field for the API, but I wanted to add this in anyway so we can see that come through. The other thing we're going to do, in the same way as we can store app metadata in Auth0 against a user, we can store metadata against a customer in Stripe as well. So I want to have a two-way relationship here. We already know the ID within Auth0 of this user, and we're going to store that as the Auth0 user ID in Stripe. And then once this runs, we're going to get a customer object back. And that customer object is going to have an ID. This is what we've just gotten back from Stripe. We're going to take that ID and we're going to set the app metadata on the user. So we've stored it in here. So quickly overviewing again, if we've already created a customer account for the user, we do nothing. Otherwise, we create a Stripe customer. We tell Stripe what the Auth0 user ID is. And then when we get that customer back from Stripe, we store that Stripe customer ID in the Auth0 user. Let's do a couple of things and then we can test this out. So I'm going to hit deploy. And what this does is it makes this code available to be added into an authorization flow. It's not actually live yet, it's just available. So we need to jump over to the flows tab over here now and into login because we created a login action. And then on the right hand side here, if we jump over to the custom tab, we can see the link user to Stripe action that we created. We can drag that in here. Now we're going to create another one in a second, and it's kind of cool because you can actually choose whether it runs before or after. So this is a nice way of visualizing in a low code, no code kind of a way what's going to happen as you go from the starting point of user logging in all the way to the completion and the tokens being issued to the application. So now we can make sure by clicking apply that every person who logs in has a Stripe customer ID. So just checking my notes to make sure I'm not missing anything. I'm not. This should now work. Let's jump back to our React tab over here. I'm going to hit logout because we want to be able to log in again. And then I'll log in. Now, regardless of whether I create a new user now or sign up with the existing user, it's going to execute that action that we had. And once that happens, we're logged in. That's fine. Let's jump back in over here now and have a look at our user. So under user management users, you'll see here's the account that I created. Last login was a couple of seconds ago, but there are two logins. The first one when I created the account and the one just now. And if we look inside this user object, you'll see here that we've got the user metadata. And this is an empty object. You can store any arbitrary data, JSON in here that you want. And the app metadata. This was an empty object, but now we can see the Stripe customer ID has been inserted into there. So now next time the action runs, and it checks to see if there's a Stripe customer ID already, it's going to see this and say, we don't need to do it again. So the Stripe customer ID here starts with a K and ends in an E. And my user ID starts with a 6 and ends in an E. So we jump over to our customers in Stripe. We should see this account here that was automatically generated, created at 11 minutes past 10 or 11 past 8 for most of you. And if we jump inside here, we'll see that the customer ID starts with K and ends with an E, which is what we had in Auth0. And the Auth0 ID starts with a 6 and ends in an E. That's the one we had in Auth0 as well. So we now have a two-way relationship. Getting tangled in my cords here. We have a two-way relationship between the Auth0 user and the Stripe customer ID. So what do we do with it? Let's augment some access tokens so that we can make calls to our API and provide information to that API about who's using it. So just very quickly, when you're looking at OpenID Connect-based authentication, you have ID tokens and access tokens, and sometimes also refresh tokens. I won't go into refresh tokens today. The ID token is basically a JSON web token, where if you decode it, and they're not encrypted, you could decode it with an online tool, you can get a JSON payload of information about the user. Things like their email address, their name, various things. Then you've got an access token. And an access token can either be what's called an opaque token, which is some random string, which means nothing, or it can be a JSON web token, which contains more information. And in our case, that's what we want to do, because that access token is basically We also call it a bearer token. It's a credential that we can pass from our React app into the Netlify function. So the Netlify function can know who's using the endpoint. In the case of the get product endpoint, we don't care who's using it. We want to display the product list to everyone. But when it comes to buying something, we care who's clicked that button because that's the person who's buying it. So let's see what we're up to here. So the next thing we want to do is create a new action, which is going to allow us to add this access token to the or add the Stripe customer ID rather to the access token that gets returned to our web application when the user logs in. This might start getting a little bit blurry, but it will come together again. So let's jump back into Actions library, and we're going to create a new action. Oops, build a custom action, and this is going to be called add Stripe customer ID to access token. I don't know if there's a maximum length on these, but that's nice and descriptive. And we'll create that. And I'll copy and paste just to make our lives easier again. And here's what we're going to do. Let's actually replace the whole thing with that. There we go. So after the person's logged in, we're going to again check to see if they have a Stripe customer ID. They should have, because we're going to run this after we make sure they have, but you know, things can always go wrong. So we want to make sure that they have a Stripe customer ID before we rely on it. If a network operation fails, for example, on the previous one, maybe we don't. So assuming the user has a Stripe customer ID in their app metadata, we're going to set a custom claim. So I'll have a look at the access token in a second, and I'll show you how that custom claim works. But essentially, a custom claim has to start with a URL. That's just a convention for namespacing. So we're going to use, it doesn't actually matter what it is, but I'm going to use the URL of my actual application. Let's paste that in there. And the actual name of the claim that I want to make. So a claim, essentially within JSON Web Tokens, you have claims and values, or claims which have keys and values. And a claim is things like, my name is Ben. That's my claim. A JSON Web Token, because it's signed, is something that a piece of computer software can consume, verify the signature, and then it knows the claim has not been modified. So we're going to make a claim now that the person who's just logged in has a Stripe customer ID equal to the value of the Stripe customer ID in the app metadata. So this is now going to get added into the access token that gets returned as part of the login flow. And we will have a look at that so you can see how that works. If you're not familiar with ID and access tokens, it doesn't matter overly. So let's deploy that. And we'll go back to our flows over here. And we'll see our add Stripe customer ID to access token. Now we need to make sure we drop this after, because if we did drop it before, then obviously the first time somebody logs in, that would fail. So we want to make sure that it's in the right order. We're going to make sure the user has a Stripe account, and then we're going to add their Stripe customer ID to the access token. We need to do a couple of other things now to the authentication flow as part of getting that access token in. But let's continue on with the README so we get it all in the right order. So because our API needs to know about the authentication of the user, we need Auth0 to know about the API. Again, it's all about Auth0 understanding the structure of your application so it can make sure that the data that any of your systems get is only intended for those systems. So let's jump back into our Auth0 account over here. And it does say here we'll go to Applications APIs. So before we came to Applications and defined our web store here. That's for our front-end React app. We're now going to define our API. So let's come in here, create a new API. We're going to call this my web store API. And the identifier can be anything, really, but I'm going to use the domain. It usually is a domain by convention. I'm just going to use the domain of the web application that I'm using. This is basically it's just an identifier. We don't actually use this URL. The URL never gets hit. You don't have to host the API here, but it's basically an identifier so that your API knows that the information is intended for your API. That sounds vague, but Hopefully this will come back together when we look at the code. So we'll create this, and essentially that's all we need to do. That's done now. If we were implementing down here, we can copy this sample code for Express, for example. Again, there's a lot of quick starts to get you going. We've now defined the API as an entity within our Auth0 tenant. So now we can go and make some changes to our React application. So if we come back over to our index page here, this is where we put in the Auth0 provider. So at the moment, what we're doing is we're saying we want to log in here, and it's for this client. And this client is a representation of our React app. It's at this point here that we define which APIs we want to be able to talk to. And we call them audiences. Kind of like, you're my audience, my talk is intended for you. In this case, our API is going to be the audience because the access token is going to be intended for that API. So we'll add in an audience, and we'll paste in the identifier that I used in Auth0 when I defined the API over there. We'll hit save. I'm just wondering whether I can reformat this to make it a bit easier to read. I don't know what it's going to do when I... Sometimes it does auto formatting, sometimes it doesn't. Let's see whether it prefers. Who knows? Anyway, a little bit more formatted. So we've added the audience in now. Basically what we're now saying is that when the person logs in, so we're going to have to log out and back in again for this to take effect. When the person logs in, we want an access token that we can use for this API. So that's this part here that we've done. And now what we can do is do a log out and log back in again. And jwt.io, which we'll have a look at in a second, is a tool that a colleague of mine wrote, which helps you look at what's going on inside a JSON Web Token. So let's see what's actually going on. And we'll see the ID token and the access token in operation. So let's log in, and I'm going to open my network tab over here so we can pull some information out. And we'll log in. So as part of the communication over here, we can see there's a request that's gone to dev slash, that's probably a bit small, there we go, dev slash, it doesn't want to go any wider. That's my Auth0 tenant. That's what I've just logged into. And it's made an options request and then a post request token. This post request is basically the React application saying, hey, I know somebody just logged in. Can you tell me more about them? And as part of that, the response comes back with an access token and an ID token. So let's have a look at an ID token first. So jwt.io, as I mentioned, is a great tool for looking into what's going on in a JSON Web Token. We have the red part is our header, purple part is our payload, and the blue part is our signature. And if we look at the payload, we can see here what Auth0 knows about me. It knows my nickname, which is taken from my email address. It knows a photo of me. It knows my email address. It knows whether or not my email is validated. So when I first logged in, it would have sent me an email saying, can you confirm that this is your email address? And if I click on that link, this will change to true. It's got things like the issuer, where I logged in, my subject. You'll recognize that this is the Auth0 user ID that we've seen before, and a couple of other things. But the thing that we're interested in today is the access token. So if we load this one up, we'll see in here, and I'll skip the first line. Some of you might be able to see what's going on here already for that one. But we've got an issuer. Again, where did the person log in? We've got the subject of the user. SUB is always the subject of the user about the token. So that's me. We can see here the audience, which says this token can be consumed by our API and also the user info endpoint at Auth0, when it was issued, when it expires. But also up here, this is where we defined the Stripe customer ID. So the customer ID that got created is now available to our React application by looking at this, this access token. And in fact, more importantly, it's available to our API that the React application is going to pass along. So the React application can now take this access token and pass that along as part of the request to the API. The API now knows who is purchasing the product because it's all wrapped up in this access token. I hope that's making sense. All right, so next step. Let's start a Stripe checkout. So we need to write another API endpoint. The way that Stripe works at this point is when you click Add to Cart, is in the background, what it's actually going to do is go off to Stripe and say, somebody wants to purchase this product, give me a URL to redirect them to. Stripe will then return that URL and will then redirect them there. They can then complete the purchase, and then they get redirected back to our success page. So first thing I'm going to do is install the serverless JWT Netlify module for NPM, which is basically going to allow us to look at JSON Web Tokens in our Netlify functions. We're almost there, 6 minutes. I think we'll actually make it. All right, we've got that one done. So the next thing I want to do is create this new function. So we already know that functions go into the Netlify functions directory. So under web store, new file, Netlify functions, we're going to create a function called buy, because that's what we want to do. We want to buy something. Let's copy and paste and go through it as we usually do. So we already have our Stripe secret key in our environment variables. That's all good. So we create a Stripe object for that. We're also going to pull out the module that we just installed and pull out the Netlify JSON Web Token verifier. And this is going to be configured to use the Auth0 issuer and audience. So in order to get these working, I'm going to copy the issuer. Where am I? Over here. Applications. So if you jump back into your application over here, so we've got our domain and our client ID. The domain is also the issuer because that's where we're logging in. So I'll copy this and jumped into that one place again, didn't I? What was I working on? By.js. Here we go. So we'll come in here, and actually I've already got them in environment variables, so let's do it the proper way. Let's put them into environment variables because that's what we've been doing for the API. So we'll grab the issuer and the audience like this. All right, back on track. Let's copy the domain back in here, and we're going to paste that in there. Now, note that I did put the domain in there, but it's also still wrapped by the HTTPS because the issuer is a URL as opposed to just the domain. And the Auth0 audience is going to be the name of the API URL up here that we've got. So the only thing we need to make sure is that there's no slash at the end of the, actually no, we need to make sure that it's the same as what we have in Auth0, which might actually have the slash at the end. Because again, yeah, so the identifier here has a slash and it's a string comparison. So we need to make sure it's actually equal to this value here. I could have just added the slash, I guess. All right, so I'm saving that, which means I need to restart Netlify, but it stopped anyway. So let's start Netlify over here, and we'll carry on looking at what's going on in the buy function. So basically what we're doing is we're configuring JWT verifier to know that tokens issued by our tenant that are intended for this API are valid. And then what we can do is define this async function that gets returned. We're going to wrap it in JWT verify. And what this means is that the function that we're exporting, the anonymous function that we have here, will only operate if JWT verify verifies the JSON Web Token. So you can't run this now without a valid access token. And the first thing we want to do is pull out of the access token the claim that is equal to the Stripe customer ID claim that I had. Now remember that this part here is actually different. That should be this here. And we'll make sure that this one's updated as well. And this one. So we're going to pull the claim out. This is the claim that we saw in jwt.io. That's this one here. So we're essentially pulling out the customer ID. And then we're going to grab the body from the request, which is the product ID that we're buying. And we're going to create a new checkout session. On success, we're going to come back to the success page. If they click the cancel button, we'll cancel the operation, take them back to the home page. But what we're saying is we want somebody to be able to buy something with their credit card. This is the Stripe customer ID, which we're getting from the access token. And we want them to be able to buy this product that came through in the payload. They're going to buy one of them. and we return the session information. And this is actually going to return not the purchase information, but the URL that we need to redirect the user to complete the purchase process. So if we save that, just check that it's working. We need to wire up the UI. So the buy button at the moment isn't actually talking to the buy function we've just written. So let's do that. Let's copy this and come back to the home page. So when we click the buy button, or when we render the buy button, when we click the buy button here, it runs this buy function. So let's paste in what we just copied. We can see also that we added this get access token silently. So I'll just get rid of this line here because that's duplicating things. So we're getting the access token silently. What this means is our React app can request the access token, but if the access token isn't available because the user's not logged in, which should not be the situation here, it's not going to fail. It's not going to give us a horrible exception. And then what we can do is we can grab that access token, and that will return to us the actual access token that we want to return or include in our request to the buy function. And then using fetch, which is a standard HTTP request mechanism, we're going to call our buy function. And this time we're going to use a post method as opposed to get, because we want to push information in. And here's the authentication part, or the authorization part. We're going to define a header as part of this request. And the authorization header, if it starts with bearer, what comes after it is a token. Not necessarily always a JSON web token, but in this case it is. So we're basically saying, look, we've got this access token, which includes information about who's wanting to buy this. We're going to pass that in as a bearer token. Then into the body, we're going to provide the price ID, which is the ID of the price object within the product that we've just bought. And the response of that is going to be JSON, which when we decode it, is going to return as a URL. And that's where we need to redirect the user to. So we use window location assign to redirect them to the Stripe payment page. A lot happened in this step, and I hope the logic can be followed. So let's come back in here, and just to make sure we've got everything in place, we're going to log out and log back in again to make sure all the access tokens are correct. And now if I click on the Apply Now button, it's going to make the request to the API, which is going to start a checkout process with Stripe, which is going to return a payload, including a URL, which is going to be returned to our React application, and then will be redirected to the checkout page. Let's see if it works. Hey, there's our checkout page. And you can see that it already knows who I am by virtue of knowing the Stripe customer ID because it's pulled out the correct email address. If I'd already bought something before, it could also potentially pre-fill my credit card information. So let's put in a test credit card. And we'll buy this product. I'm going to save the info for future purposes. Actually, no, I'm not, because otherwise I'm going to have to wait for an SMS to come through, and we don't have time for that. Let's just double check to see. Let's go back to the home page, and we'll buy some runners. I've not tested this before. Is it going to give me my credit card information? It's not. But anyway. So now if we come back into our customers over here, we'll be able to refresh this and see some events going on. You can see a couple of payments have come through. I haven't paid the $49 for the runners yet, but I have paid $149 for the headphones, or the other way around. And all of this is tied together through the Auth0 and Stripe customer ID. So that, I believe, testing the site, that's what we just did. So that's that. We now have a fully functional, and I would argue, a production ready. Like there's not a lot in here that would not be ready for production. There are certain things that could go wrong. I haven't done any exception handling in here. If the Stripe customer or the Stripe checkout process failed, for example, you would probably want to show some kind of error messaging. I'm not showing any of that side. But in terms of pure business functionality, without having to spin up our own database, in pretty much an hour and a half, because we started at about 4 past, we managed to get, I hope some of you did. I know a lot of you went into listening mode. I managed to get a web store up and running, and I hope that at least by following the video again afterwards, if you're so inclined, that you will also be able to get a web store up and running in about an hour and a half, maybe 3, with just using Auth0, Stripe, and Netlify. So many new tools to play with, says Jeremy. Thanks for a great troll. You're welcome. Thanks, Jeremy. One of the things that still boggles my mind is I've been a software engineer now for 20-something years, and I still remember if you wanted to spin up a web store like this back in, I know, even 2010, but 2000 when I first started, you'd be spending months. You'd be spinning up your own probably physical server. If you couldn't get a virtual server, you'd be doing all the backend in PHP, probably, or Visual Basic, ASP, VB, whatever it was called. It would have taken forever to do this. And to be able to have the tools, as you say, Jeremy, to create this so easily and free. Like, this hasn't cost anybody anything. Well, it's cost Auth0 and Netlify because we're using their services, and Stripe. But yeah, I mean, the Auth0 have a free tier, Netlify have a free tier, and Stripe only charge you if you take money. So go forth and profit and have fun with this. And thank you for your time.